You ever heard that some promises can never be broken? What if I told you that certain oaths don't belong only to the living? Many believe that true friendship lasts forever. But what if that forever was meant literally? Two friends made a blood pact, sealing a promise to never part ways. An innocent gesture? Perhaps. But what they didn't know was that some words, when spoken under a full moon, are heard by ears that were never meant to listen. What began as an unbreakable bond soon turned into a dark sentence. Time passed, and then came the unexplained disappearance. One of them vanished without a trace, and the other began to notice disturbing signs. Footprints in the dark, objects moving on their own, a whisper repeating the oath they had made years ago. What started as a childhood game became a nightmare with no way out. He searched for answers, but each discovery only reinforced a terrible truth. The pact had bound them beyond death. Now, he wasn't just being haunted, he was being summoned to fulfill his part of the deal. What would you do if you found out that a simple promise of friendship could become a curse? How far would you go to break free? This is the story of a pact with no return, where the price of loyalty may be higher than anyone could ever imagine. But be careful when making promises. Some words are never forgotten, not even on the other side. There are promises that should never be made. And when two young boys swore never to part, they had no idea of the weight their words carried. Under the pale light of the full moon, they cut their palms and joined their blood in an eternal pact. In that moment, between laughter and a handshake, they believed they were merely sealing their friendship. But the universe has its own rules, and some promises are heard by ears that don't belong to the world of the living. Time passed, but something unseen had been watching them ever since that day. The oath seemed like nothing more than a childish game, one of those stories told around a campfire. But as the years went by, little signs began to emerge. Shared nightmares, echoes of whispered voices in the dark, and a strange feeling that, even in solitude, they were never truly alone. The blood-sealed pact had not been forgotten. And in the spirit world, a promise like that is not something you can simply ignore. So when one of them disappeared without a trace, the truth revealed itself in brutal fashion. The pact they had made, unaware of the consequences, had bound them beyond what was natural. And now, the presence that had once merely watched began to manifest. Something, or someone, was there, and it had no intention of letting him escape. What was sworn under the full moon could not be undone so easily. Not all stories are just superstition. When the old lady from the village called them over to a corner of the square, her voice was a whisper loaded with warning. Words spoken under the full moon don't belong only to you, she cautioned, her eyes deep as a bottomless well. The boys answered with nervous laughter, because who would listen to an old woman with wrinkled hands and a distant gaze? But life, or something beyond it, would make sure they learned the lesson. In the beginning, the old lady's words seemed like nothing more than a fable repeated through generations. But then, the dreams began. Not ordinary dreams, but visions laden with shadows and indistinct murmurs, as if the very wind were calling their names. Objects moved without explanation, and doors that had been closed at night were found slightly open in the morning. Small signs that, when taken individually, could be dismissed. But together, they told the story of something awakening. When the first disappearance occurred, the elder's warning returned like a shock. The friend who had once laughed at the warnings was now gone. The warning had been given, but it had been ignored. And in the silence of the nights that followed, a dark truth crept in. Some promises are never forgotten, not even by death itself. Now, all that remained for the young man was to discover how far that pact would take him. And the answer was drawing closer. The day dawned strange, heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. His friend didn't show up at their usual meeting spot, nor did he reply to messages. At first, the young man tried to convince himself it was just a delay, a simple misunderstanding. But as the hours passed with no news, fear seeped into his mind. He went to his friend's house, knocked on the door countless times. Nothing. No sound, no sign of life. As if he had simply ceased to exist. The police were called, searches were conducted, but no clues were found. No footprints leading away, no camera footage capturing any movement. Just a tidy room, an untouched bed, and a phone still plugged into the charger. But the young man knew there was more to it. Because that night, as he tried to sleep, he felt a presence in the darkness of his room. A chill ran down his spine when a faint whisper cut through the silence. The same oath made years ago, repeated like a macabre prayer. In the days that followed, that presence became constant. An invisible weight that followed him wherever he went. A reflection out of place in the window's glass. A shadow where there should have been nothing. Fear was no longer just psychological, it was real. And then came the crushing realization. The pact had not been forgotten. His friend might have vanished from the world of the living, but he had not completely left. And now, he seemed to be getting closer. The nightmare truly began when he found the first muddy footprints inside his house. At first, he thought it was his imagination. Maybe he had tracked dirt in without noticing. But when he saw the footprints appearing out of nowhere, leading from the door to his bedroom, his blood ran cold. Each mark on the floor looked deeper, as if something heavy had walked there, something that no longer belonged to this world. And the worst part, they always appeared at night. Objects started moving on their own. Small shifts that could be ignored at first glance, until things began disappearing and reappearing in strange places. The radio turned on by itself, always on the same station, playing a distorted melody he didn't recognize. Mirrors fogged up without reason, revealing dark shapes that didn't belong to him. But nothing was as disturbing as the familiar whisper, carried by the wind, repeating the promise made years ago. We will never be apart. The nights had become unbearable. Every noise, every shadow seemed to be hiding something. He locked the doors, turned on all the lights, but he knew none of it would help. Something was there with him, something that shouldn't be. And no matter how much he tried to escape the truth, the message was clear. The pact was still active, and his friend had not forgotten. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being summoned to fulfill his part of the deal. Desperate for answers, he decided to search his missing friend's room. He looked in every corner, opening drawers, rummaging through boxes, trying to find any clue that could explain what was happening. That's when, among old notebooks and yellowed papers, he found a hidden diary at the back of the closet. His heart pounded as he flipped through the pages, filled with frantic notes, scribbles, and words crossed out as if someone had tried to erase a dangerous secret. But one sentence, highlighted in shaky letters, made his breath stop. Never break the pact. The following pages were even more disturbing. His friend described premonitory dreams in which shadows dragged him to a place of no return. He spoke of eyes watching him from the darkness, of voices calling his name. If I disappear, one of the last entries read, don't try to find me. Don't fight it. Don't run, or he will come for you too. It was a desperate warning, but now it was too late. The pact couldn't be undone so easily. The words written there confirmed what he had already suspected but refused to believe. His friend knew something was coming to collect them. He knew that the promise made on that full moon night was not just a game. Now, only one suffocating question remained. Was there still a way to escape? The diary held no answers, only warnings. And each line seemed to push him further toward an inevitable fate. Fear no longer allowed him to sleep. Each night was a battle against the invisible presence stalking him, each shadow a reminder of the unbreakable pact. That was when, out of options, he decided to seek help in the only place where the village stories claimed answers could be found, the witch's house. A woman who lived in isolation, feared by many, but known for dealing with forces no one dared to name. He arrived hesitantly, but before he could even knock on the door, she was already waiting for him. I felt it when he returned, she said, her gaze piercing into his soul. The witch needed no explanations. She simply touched his hand and murmured something incomprehensible. Then, as if reading the lines of fate itself, she revealed what he feared most. The pact has bound your souls. Your friend is not gone. He is trapped between worlds, and now he wants to take you too. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. He tried to argue, to seek another solution, but the woman only shook her head. Some things cannot be undone without a price, she warned. And the longer you resist, the stronger he will become. The witch's eyes reflected an unsettling truth. He could no longer ignore the call. But what if there was a way to escape? What if there was a way to break the promise without paying the ultimate price? With one last enigmatic look, the witch handed him a small pouch of herbs and a warning. When the time comes, you will have to choose. But remember, everything has a cost, and some debts are never left unpaid. The young man left with more questions than answers. What did this choice mean? And what would be the real price of freedom? It wouldn't wait for him to decide. That night, a chilling whisper called his name, dragging him out of the house, guided by an invisible force. His steps led him to the old city cemetery, a place he had always avoided, but which now seemed unavoidable. Among the worn tombstones, a forgotten grave stood out, the earth still damp as if it had just been disturbed. And then he saw it, the shadow of his friend, motionless, waiting. It was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was real. "You promised," said the voice from the other side, deep and laced with something inhuman. The young man felt his chest tighten, his knees nearly gave out. This wasn't just a memory, not just an apparition. His friend was there, caught between two worlds, bound by a promise made years ago. He reached out a hand, inviting him to cross the final boundary. "Your time has come," he said, and in that moment, the chill of death seemed to envelop the air around him. The pact was being claimed, and he had to choose. But fear gave way to defiance. How could he accept a fate he never understood? How could he walk a path he hadn't consciously chosen? His heart told him there was still a chance, a thread of hope. He remembered what the witch had said, everything has a price. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to repay the debt without giving up his soul. But to do that, he'd have to act fast. Time was running out, and his friend's spirit wouldn't accept refusal so easily. Desperation consumed him, but fear could not outweigh his will to live. He remembered the witch's words, the small pouch of herbs she'd given him, and the single chance he still had. He ran back home, rummaging through drawers until he found the object of the oath, an old red ribbon, kept as a symbol of the promise made long ago. His hands trembled as he prepared the ritual, lighting candles, spreading the herb powder, and reciting the sacred words the witch had taught him. The fire flared up, consuming the ribbon in blue flames that lit up the darkness. But the response was immediate. The house shook, the windows rattled, and a scream echoed through the room, a sound not of this world. His friend's shadow appeared in the mirror, eyes filled with something like hatred and pain. "You cannot break what has been sealed," his voice echoed, distorted, as if coming from a distant place. The young man felt the weight of the pact pulling him, as though something was trying to drag him to the other side. Burning the symbol of the promise wasn't enough. The connection between them was deeper than any physical object. The spirit advanced, the lights flickering violently, and the young man felt his body being pulled, his soul on the verge of being torn away. He clung to the only thing that still held him there, his own will. He shouted the final words of the ritual, pushing back the presence trying to claim him. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The spirit recoiled, eyes full of fury and of a broken promise. But the fight wasn't over. Something inside told him the price for this attempt at freedom was yet to come. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. He felt the air grow heavy, dense, as if something unseen was watching him from every corner. Then, a faint echo of the witch's voice stirred in his mind. Everything has a price. The ritual hadn't been enough to sever the bond, only to weaken it. If he truly wanted to be free, he would have to offer something in return. But what? The answer came as a cold whisper in his ear. One promise for another. He realized that he couldn't simply undo the pact without creating another in its place. The only way to break free was to forge a new commitment. But with whom? And at what cost? The witch had already warned him that some debts are never truly settled. If he offered something without thinking, he might condemn himself or someone he loved. The spirit of his friend still lingered nearby, waiting, watching. A decision had to be made. What was he willing to lose in order to move forward? With his breath unsteady, he made his choice. Kneeling before the still flickering fire, he spoke his new promise in a firm voice. He didn't know exactly what he was giving up, but he could feel that an exchange had been accepted. The weight around him seemed to lift, but not completely. Was he free? Or had he merely delayed the inevitable? The sensation that something had been taken from him was strong, yet he couldn't quite grasp what it was. And deep down, he feared that the answer would only come when it was too late. For a few days, he believed it was over. The silence returned, objects stopped moving on their own, and for the first time in weeks, he managed to sleep without feeling invisible eyes watching him. But the peace was short-lived. That night, as he brushed his teeth, something caught his attention in the mirror. In his reflection, He saw himself, but something was wrong. His face looked different, paler, his eyes slightly sunken. A chill ran down his spine as he realized. His reflection didn't blink at the same time he did. His blood ran cold. He blinked again, this time on purpose, and the reflection lagged a second before mimicking him. Terror gripped his body as he watched the other side smile on its own, a cold, familiar smile. It was impossible, yet there was the proof. The exchange had been made, but not in the way he had imagined. Something of him had been left behind, or worse, something had taken his place. He stepped away from the mirror, his heart pounding, but he knew running wouldn't help. The pact still existed, one way or another. The relief he had felt before had been an illusion. The witch had warned him that certain debts are never truly repaid, and now he understood what she meant. Perhaps he had never really been free. Perhaps the promise he made had only changed the shape of his curse. He still didn't know what it all meant, but one thing was certain. This story was far from over. And deep down, he feared it never would be. Now tell me, how far would you go to keep a promise? And what if you knew that a simple oath could turn into an eternal sentence? The young man in this story learned the hard way that words have weight, that certain bonds cannot be severed without consequences. He tried to escape, tried to break the pact, but in the end, he realized that some debts are never truly settled. Had he really freed himself from this connection? Or had he only postponed the inevitable? And you, have you ever made a promise you regretted? Are there words you've spoken carelessly, unaware that they might still be haunting you? Stories like this make us reflect on the power of our words, on what we give away without even noticing. Have you ever stopped to think about the promises you made in the past and what you might be paying for now? Maybe the real question isn't just about supernatural pacts, but about the commitments we make without fully understanding the consequences. If this story gave you chills, imagine how many other stories are still out there, waiting to be told. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because in the next video, you'll uncover more secrets that many prefer to keep hidden. And tell me in the comments, what's the strangest promise you've ever made? I'll be watching, but be careful with your answer. Some words are never forgotten.